In this, our 19th lecture, we continue our exploration of the life lessons that we learned from the great books, and we turn now to the fourth of our themes, adventure. We have examined the unconquerable human spirit. We have looked at how we live our lives from youth to old age and everything in between, and we have examined love. And in fact, in our last lecture, we looked at the brave new world that had banished love. And it also had banished adventure. In the brave new world of Aldous Huxley, there's no room for the personal adventurer, the person who will stake everything on the chance for glory or just excitement, seeking out worlds that have never been. But adventure is at the heart of the true human spirit, and it is at the heart of some of the greatest books ever written, books that can still speak to us today. And here we will look at the Odyssey. We will look at the tale of the Trojan War and the Philoctetes by Sophocles. We'll look at two great heroic stories of the Middle Ages, the Song of Roland and the Nibelungen Lied. We will follow Meriwether Lewis and William Clark across the continent, and we will look at one of the most romantic and complex and troubled figures of the 20th century, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia, who published a translation of the Odyssey. And a very good translation it was indeed. And so we start with the book that Lawrence admired so much, the Odyssey. The Odyssey by Homer is the very definition of a great book. It has a great theme, which we will explore. It is written in noble language. And the Iliad and the Odyssey, these magnificent epic poems, were like the Bible to the ancient Greeks. They played the same role that the Bible did in America of the 19th century. Every moral idea, every quote you could look for could come out of the Iliad or out of the Odyssey. And the poetry of Homer was so elevating to the spirit that there were many Greeks who could recite the whole of the Iliad and the whole of the Odyssey. And they speak across the ages. In fact, the British Prime Minister of the 19th century, Gladstone, believed that you could, out of the Iliad and the Odyssey, develop the entire moral code you needed to live a good and just life, and he thought that the curriculum of Oxford should be reformed just to read the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greek. All you needed to know was in Homer. And I believe they can still speak to us today. Homer composed both the Iliad and the Odyssey. You'll read other things, but I am quite convinced that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by one surpassing intellectual and poetic genius, sometime in the 8th century BC, but separated by years. And the Iliad is a poem of a young poet. It is a story of the glory of war. And the Odyssey is composed by Homer in his later years. It is a poem of an old man who just wants to get home and to find peace and quiet, but who knows all the troubles that life can bring. And nobody knew these troubles better than Odysseus, the man of many wiles, the man who knew how to tell many a lie and to tell it well, a man who saw many parts of the world, and who took 10 long years to come back from the war against Troy. Odysseus had been somewhat dubious of this war from the very beginning. He had not really wanted to go, but all the heroes of Greece went, and he was really forced to go. And he was not surprised when the war dragged on there beyond, around the walls of Troy, year after year after year. He was the most intelligent of the Greeks, but also a brave warrior. But he was also simply clever at understanding people and how to get things done. And he tried to end the war in various ways, putting an end to the bloodshed. But finally, Troy itself fell. And Odysseus understood that it is at the very moment of triumph, when the Greeks had won this great victory that they had fought 10 long years for, it's at the height of your power that you must be most careful of committing hubris. The outrageous arrogance, the abuse of power, the outrage of an innocent that brings the wrath of the gods upon you. And at the very moment of triumph, the Greeks broke into the temple of Athena, the goddess who had supported them all through the war, the personal patron, divinity, and friend of Odysseus. He wasn't part of this. But they carried away from the altar where she was clean in sanctuary Cassandra, the daughter of King Priam. Cassandra, the prophetess who could look into the future, who had been beloved by Apollo and had given her the gift of looking into the future. But when she had rejected his advances, he let her keep that gift, but cursed her that no one would ever believe what she prophesied. She had tried to tell the Trojans not to bring the great horse into the wall, but they had not listened. And now she was outraged and ravished by the Greeks there at the altar. And the gods said, "We have given the Greeks victory, now we'll make them pay long and hard for it." And few of the Greeks had an easy homecoming. Agamemnon came back to his home at Mycenae to be murdered by his own wife. Menelaus, his brother, was cast ashore on the beaches of Egypt. But none of them suffered so long and hard as did Odysseus. And his tale, the Odyssey, is Homer's reflection upon all the sadness and trouble that life can bring. They had won the battle at Troy, and Odysseus was ready to take his men back home, sailing back to Ithaca. And he told them, "Boys, let's just get in our ships and go straight home." But they had developed a taste for warfare and a taste for the plunder that went with it. And they said, "Oh, King Odysseus, just one more raid along the coast. Well, there's a land up there called the land of the Ciconians. We can defeat them easily and plunder their women, their cattle, their gold. Boys, I don't think it's a good idea. We're well enough alone. Let's go home." But they wouldn't listen. So he led them on this raid. And the Ciconians were fierce fighters, drove them back down to their ships, and they barely escaped with their lives. And the winds now came up. And the winds drove them day after day after day into uncharted waters. And finally they reached a land pleasant to look upon, warm in its climate, with date palms. And Odysseus told his men, "A few of you go ashore. Look around, see what land this is." Long time went by. Men he had sent ashore never came back. So Odysseus went looking for them. And there they were, sniffing the flowers of the lotus, absolutely forgetful of home and family. And he had to drag them away from this sweet place of repose and continue back trying to get home. But the gods were now angered with him, including his divinity Athena. And Poseidon, the god of the sea, was absolutely furious with Odysseus. And so a huge storm came up and drove them further into uncharted waters. You know, once the disasters start to come, they come in battalions, not one by one. And they have driven Odysseus ashore. And his men land, and it's another beautiful-looking place. Fair fields with vineyards in them, wheat growing in the fields, and Odysseus takes a few of his men, and they go ashore to explore. The rest of his men are still in their 12 boats, but these go inshore. And they come to this huge cave. And Odysseus leads his men in there, and it's an astonishing-looking place. There are all of these cheeses on the walls and pails filled with milk. Well, they're hungry. Surely the owner of such magnificent wealth will not be angry, so they eat a few cheeses, drink a little bit of the milk, and then as they're resting, waiting for the owner to come back, maybe he can give them some advice on how to get back to their home in Ithaca. This huge shadow fills up the door, and it is the Cyclops Polyphemus, one of the offspring of Zeus, with an eye right in the center of his forehead. And he comes in, brings his sheep in, because he's kind to his sheep. He's a herdsman. And he brings them all in, puts them in their little pens there inside the cave, then rolls this huge stone over the cave. And he looks down and says, "Who are you? Are you pirates?" No, we're not pirates. We're just men who've come for Troy, and we're lonely and hungry." "And you ate my cheese?" "Yes, we ate your cheese. You drank my milk without asking? Yes, yes, we didn't think you'd mind. Oh, you didn't think I'd mind? No, the god Zeus requires us to take care of the strangers. I don't care a thing for the god Zeus, says Polyphemus. But I'll tell you what, I'm a little hungry. So he grabs two of Odysseus's men, bites their heads off the way you'd snap a can off, and drinks their blood and then crunches them up the way you'd eat up a chicken wing. Crunch-ty, crunch-ty, crunch. There, he said. No. Falls asleep. Well, they're in a serious situation, wouldn't you agree? But Odysseus is a man never at a loss. But he's a little worried now. And Polyphemus wakes up the next morning, lets his little sheep go out so they can graze, milks them all, and then puts that stone back in place. And Odysseus' men have to wait. In the meantime, while he's milking his sheep, he has a little more breakfast and eats two more of Odysseus' men. So the number of men is failing fast, and they've got to come up with an idea. So all during that day, Odysseus ponders this dilemma. And there are these huge poles that make the pens where the sheep stay inside the cave. And Odysseus' men, several of them having to handle one of these poles, pull it down, sharpen its end into a point, and then burn it in the fire to make it hardened. Then they remember they have brought with them a large container, a sheepskin of wine that has been given to them along the way. And they pull it out, and Polyphemus comes back in the evening, lets the sheep in, puts the great stone in front of the door again, and then Odysseus steps forward and says, how would you like some wine? And he has a cup of it and says, very good wine. I think it'll go great with this nice red wine. It'll go great with these two men. So he kills two more of them, bites their heads off, gobbles them up, and then says, you know, you've done me a favor there. Mister, what is your name? And Odysseus, are you going to tell a stranger your name? No, he says, they call me Nobody. Oh, Nobody. Well, Nobody, I'm going to do a favor for you. What's that? I'm going to eat you last of them all. Then Polyphemus falls asleep. And Odysseus and his men take that sharpened stake again, put it in the fire, twist it and twist it and twist it till the end is all hot. And then while Polyphemus is sleeping there and he's sort of, burping in his sleep, and this blood mingled with some human flesh is gurgling out of his mouth as he lies there snoring, they take that great pole and drive it into his eye and spin it around and around until the black ooze burst out like an oil well, sizzling and bubbling. Well, he's in terrible pain, and he jumps up and he's trying to grab them, but he only has one eye, so he's blind. And he starts shrieking. And there are other Cyclops who live in the area, and they hear all this shrieking, and they come to their doors, and they shout out, who's hurting you, Polyphemus? And he says, nobody is hurting me. Well, then, we're going back to sleep if nobody is hurting you. But you still got another dilemma. Have you thought what it was? How are you going to get out? When the morning comes, Polyphemus is determined to capture them. He's going to go all around that cave feeling for them. But his little sheep start baaing. Because, see, they want to be milked, and then they want to go out and eat. And he cares a lot for them, so he milks them. Then he's going to let them go out and eat, but he's going to be very careful. He stands in that doorway, and every creature that comes through, he feels on the back. So to be sure it's a woolly sheep. And Odysseus ties 3 of the sheep together, and then each one of his men hangs under the belly of these 3 sheep. Then another 3 are tied together, and another person hangs under it. And every time they slip out, Polyphemus feels them and thinks they're sheep. So they get away. But Odysseus can't let it go at that. He's got to let Polyphemus know what they've done. So he starts shouting, we've tricked you this time. They've made it to their boats. They start rowing away. Polyphemus gets to the cliff. He can hear where the noise is coming from. And Odysseus shouts and says, we tricked you. And Polyphemus said, who are you? Who did this to me? And Odysseus has to say, it is Odysseus himself. And that gives Polyphemus just the clue, hurls a big boulder, crushes some of the ships. But nonetheless, Odysseus and some of his men have gotten away. So, one adventure. Then they come to another island, and this is a very strange island. It seems to hover in the middle of the water. They land there, and it's a beautiful castle, and they meet the king, King Aeolus. And Aeolus says to them, you have suffered very greatly. I would like to let you go home. And he pulls Odysseus aside and said, I can, for a very brief while, tie up all the bad winds. I'll tie them up in this big sack, give the sack to you. When you finally get back to Ithaca, let them loose, for I am the king of the winds. He gives Odysseus this big sack. Odysseus gets on his boat. He and his men start rowing away, but you got to picture these men. They wonder, our king just met with this other king. He's gotten this big bag. What do you think has to be in there? Gold, right? And so when Odysseus falls asleep, they open it up, but it's terrible winds, and it blows them away once again, far to the lands of the Lastrygonians, where they must fight, and finally to the island of the goddess Circe, the witch. And they have landed there, cold, wet, exhausted. And once again, Odysseus sends a few of his men into the interior of the island to explore it. And they don't come back. Send some more in. They don't come back. Send some more in. They don't come back. And finally, he goes on his own, but he's too careful to go into this palace area that's there. Instead, he sees a lot of little pigs running around. And one of his men is still left who explains to him that this Circe is a witch who is able to transform by a potion humans into swines. But now the gods have begun to turn again in the favor of Odysseus. And the god Hermes is sent down by Athena, and he gives a little potion to Odysseus that will make Odysseus safe against the magic of Circe. And Odysseus goes in, and Circe meets him, and she says, "You're the most handsome of them all. How about a little love potion?" And Odysseus says, "No," pulls out his sword and says, "But I'm going to kill you unless you turn my men back into humans." And she said, "All right, but then can we go to bed?" "Oh, yes, we can go to bed," he says. Now, all this time, his wife, Penelope, is waiting for him at home in Ithaca, but it's an adventure, isn't it? And he can't be expected to stay chaste forever. So he stays here with Circe for quite a while, but his men want to go home. And they keep asking him, "King Odysseus, when are you going to take us home?" And he turns to Circe and said, "Is there not some way that you can give us the advice, the directions by which we can get back to Ithaca?" She said, "You should stay here with me. It is a long and terrifying journey back home. You will have to sail all the way to the west, to the land of the setting sun. And there you will have to go down into the underworld. And there, from the blind seer Tiresias, who once advised Oedipus himself, you will learn what you must do. And even when you come back, there will be the horrors of the monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, and on, the land of the Sirens, and on. And you'll come to the island of Apollo, and under no circumstances may you allow your men to eat the cattle of Apollo on that island of the sun." But they've gotten started, and so they sail to the west, where still today you can see people who will show you the entrance to the underworld, not far from the modern little town of Cumae, near Naples, where Odysseus went down into the underworld and moved among the shades and saw all those who had gone before, the heroes who had died around the walls of Troy. He saw Achilles and said, "How is it in the underworld?" And Achilles said, "I would rather be a slave serving a master above than to be king of this gloomy underworld." But from Tiresias, they learn the way back and confirm all the dangers they will have to go through one more time. And what Odysseus has had to do is to literally go down to death, overcome it, and be born again. And from this moment onward, he is a man who understands still the wiles of the world, but has become a new man, determined just to get home and to find peace. He has understood that that is the best thing you can have, is just peace and a family, a wife and a home. And he wants to get his men back. And they go through the great monsters of Scylla and Charybdis. You can still see those sites, we're told, along the coast of Sicily, where Sicily and Italy almost join near the town of Messina. And they roared together, almost crushing the ship of Odysseus. And then on further, in the land of the Sirens, these beautiful women whose song was so glorious that it lured men to their death. And Odysseus stops up the ears of his sailors with wax. But a little more adventures in him. And he wants to hear these songs of the Sirens. When would you ever hear them again? So he has his men tie him to the mast of the ship. And he strains and pulls and tries to get free. But he goes on through. And finally, they land on the island of the sun, the island of the god Apollo. And they just want a little rest before they go on to Ithaca. It's not far away to be home. But the winds don't blow right. The gods still don't want them to get back home. And day after day, the winds refuse to blow. And his men get hungrier and hungrier. And Odysseus tells them, the one thing we have been advised that we must not do is to eat the cows on this island. They are sacred to the god Apollo. But his men get hungrier and hungrier. So he goes off to the heights to try to scout something else for them to eat. And while he is gone, they butcher the cattle of the god, roast them and eat them. And when he comes back, the very skins on the seashore begin to bellow out, and he knows that they are lost. The winds now turn favorable, and they start off, and one more huge storm comes. The ship is wrecked, and all of his men drown. Odysseus alone survives, washed up on an island in the land of the Phaeacians. And there his journey is just about to come to an end. He is found all in the nude, wet, dirty, disheveled, starving by the princess Nausicaa, daughter of the king of the island. He is taken back to the palace, and when they learn who he is, they have him sing for them as a minstrel this tale of the wanderings. And in the midst of it, the queen of the island raises her hand and says, "You wouldn't exaggerate any of this, would you?" And he only smiles and goes on with this song. And the Phaeacians fit out a ship for him, give him food, and row him back to his homeland of Ithaca. And he is finally so calm that he has simply fallen asleep. And they take him out of the ship and lay him in this cave, a cave that seems to be a safe harbor. He's back home. But one of our life lessons is just when it looks like everything is all right, more trouble comes its way. And Odysseus never drops his guard. There he is, and this woman comes to him on the beach, and she asks him his name. And he gives her a false name and says, "I'm from Crete." And suddenly she turns into all her divine majesty and the goddess Athena. And she says, "You can never tell the truth. You lie all the time." Well, you're wise this time. There's trouble in your palace. Your wife, the chaste Penelope, for all the years you have been gone, year after year after year, the war and now all these wanderings, 20 years, she has kept faith with you. Your son is grown up, Telemachus. I barely saw him. He's a fine young man. But there are nobles on the island who are convinced you're dead, and they keep trying to make Penelope marry them. So he finally returns home, but disguised as a beggar, and comes into the courtyard of his palace. And the noblemen see him and say, "What is this beggar doing here?" But his son, not knowing who he is, comes out with all the manners of a true hero and says to the beggar, "Would you like to come in? Would you like food?" Tells the nobleman, "Leave him alone and stop pestering my mother as well, you false suitors. Bring the beggar in. Would you like a bath, sir?" And he's taken up stairs and bathed by one of the servants who have been there so many years. And as he's going up the steps, this aged dog, 20 years old, begins to wag its little tail. It's his old dog, the only one who recognizes him. And so overcome with joy is his old pup that he dies right there, the little pup. And then the nurse begins to bathe him. And as she's washing his feet, she suddenly stops and she feels this scar. And she says, "Oh, Master, you've come home." Shh, 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 shh. But she recognizes him. So the first the dog, and then his servant recognize the master coming home. He then meets privately with his son. And his son tells him the whole sordid story of these retainers, these noblemen, these suitors of his mother, who come every day, eat up all his food, pester his mother, and the only way she has kept them at bay is claiming that she is making a new robe. And every day she works on it, weaves it, and then at night she goes up and unravels it. And she keeps promising them that as soon as she gets it completed, she will marry one of them. Finally, she comes down, her son having asked her to do this, calls the suitors all together, and then the son says, Telemachus, "I have decided that truly is time for my mother to remarry. My father is never going to come home. But this you must do. I will give the hand of my mother only to the one of you who is able to string my father's bow. It has stood in the corner all these years." And one by one the noblemen go up, try to string that bow, and one after another fails. Then the old beggar, still in his raggedy clothes, says, "I'd like a try." Well, the retainers are outraged. How dare this old beggar try it? But the son says, "This is my contest. Give it a try, old fellow." And suddenly Odysseus strips off his rags, stands before them in all his majesty as a warrior, strings that bow, and then begins to let the deadly arrows fly. And one by one he kills each of these retainers. His son leaps up and locks the door so they're all trapped inside and begins to kill them as well. And all that day long they take vengeance upon the retainers. And when it is over, they even hang the girlfriends of the retainers. Yes, who've dishonored Odysseus in that way by taking up with these evil suitors. Hang them up by ropes like little quail. And finally, he is united with his wife. And they feast that night in the halls. They sing of the tale of Troy and of all the wanderings and sufferings of Odysseus. He is reunited with his son and goes up to spend the night with his wife. And so Homer tells us that the end of all of a long life's suffering may be the best thing, the best lesson that any of us can learn is stay home, take care of your family, be content with a life that doesn't bring a lot of glory, but brings happiness. And that is what Odysseus, with all his wiles, his cleverness, and his traveling, has finally learned. Come back home. Rest. Love your family. Be content. And the troubles of the world will gradually fade away. The Iliad, the story of the youth Achilles, who chose glory and a short life, or the story of Odysseus, who endured all through it to come back home and live to an old age and be happy. Each one of us may make that choice. A career of fame and ambition, putting your family aside for wealth, honor, career success, or being a quiet CPA in a small town, but enjoying life in all its small blessings.